I get asked a lot, how did you first get hooked on China? And let me just digress just for a minute and give you a sense of really what brought me to the table to write a book like this. For most of my Wall Street career, and I will be the first to admit now I'm in my post-Wall Street career, someone described me as a recovering Wall Street professional. I focused a lot on the U.S. and the global economy. And as the chief economist for Morgan Stanley in the 90s and for most of the 2000s, we had an extraordinarily talented global economics team. There are polls that investors participate in to rank teams of analysts and economists around the world. And I'm proud to say, in the late 90s, we were ranked as the #1 global economics team in the world. This was my team. I felt, an enormous sense of pride. And then along came the Asian crisis, and the #1 ranked team in the world had the worst global forecast in the world, largely because we had no idea what was happening in Asia in the depths of this wrenching crisis. I was personally humiliated by that because I just made a bunch of appearances where they were celebrating this extraordinary accomplishment of building this great global team, and we looked foolish. So the one gut instinct I operated from at the time, this was right around the summer of 1997, when all of Asia's growth miracles were in tatters, was that China, I'd been to China a number of times, but didn't really know much about China. China would hold the key to the endgame of the global financial crisis. And so I started going to China every month in the second half of 1997. It quickly became evident to me that China would not go the way of Thailand and Indonesia and South Korea, to say nothing of some of the smaller economies in the region. And the more I dug into China, the more fascinated I became with the way in which China operated strategically, putting its large reservoir of savings to work, bringing some of the infrastructure demand forward to support economic growth. And lo and behold, the crisis was over. China emerged as the new leader of the Pan-Asian economy. The former leader, Japan, was floundering. I wrote a number of articles in leading newspapers about this shift in the balance of economic power in the region. And my friends in Japan never spoke to me again, and my new friends in China were embarrassed by what I was saying about China. And a lot of sort of fortuitous events happened where I started participating in a number of high-level discussions and dialogues with senior Chinese leaders, and I got hooked. And then I came back, from that period, and a number of times I was called to testify in front of the U.S. Congress on U.S.-China relations, especially dealing with trade issues and the infamous currency issue. And it became evident to me in that exchange of views that while I was optimistic on China, the U.S. power structure did not get China. The view from the U.S. was that China needs us more than we need them, and we can count on China to sell us cheap goods, provide us with a new source of savings. We didn't have to save anymore. We could just import surplus savings from China would be fine. And by the way, we could run big deficits because China would fund our deficits. They had nowhere else to park their money. And so, that led to an interesting discourse between me and a number of members of the Congress on these key issues. And I thought long and hard about the imbalance that I saw in the relationship between the United States and China. And I framed it over time with the help of my wonderful wife, who is a psychologist, in the psychological construct of codependency. If you know anything about the pathology of codependency between individuals, it's not a very healthy relationship for two people to participate in. They depend heavily on one another initially, because of love or in some cases convenience. And they rely on each other too much to sustain their sense of self. Ultimately, their identities get blurred. They don't know who they are. They start to turn on one another, and eventually the relationship founders and sometimes leads to a rather painful breakup. And I said, aha, that is the U.S., China. And so I started to think long and hard about this, and 2.5 years ago began this book, this journey to really formalize the relationship between these two, what I believe are unbalanced economies, struggling with their identities, their sense of self, and the relationship between the two. And just a few slides to give you a sense of some of the thoughts that underpin the book. This first slide just shows you the very obvious contrast between a nation of consumers, us in America, and a nation of producers, the Chinese economy. We as consumers depend a lot on cheap goods from China to stock our shelves at Walmart to make ends meet for hard-pressed American consumers whose real incomes have been stagnant for 2 decades now. We don't save as a nation, so we borrow freely from the surplus saver, the world's largest surplus saver, China. And in doing so, China provides us with what seems to be almost an insatiable demand for U.S. treasuries, which we need because of our big budget deficits and our inability to fund our deficits ourselves. China, on the other hand, as you can see here, has a consumption share of its economy that's half the size of ours, dependent on exports and investment for economic growth. Its major export market has long been, with the exception of a few years interrupted by Europe, its major export market has been the United States. And so the dependency is a two-way street. We need them, they need us, and yet both economies in marching down the road of this codependency have become unstable, and to borrow the phraseology of former Premier Wen Jiabao, unbalanced and ultimately unsustainable. So the next China for me is sort of the first step in this journey of breaking the shackles of codependence. And I will say, for those of you who are thinking of going back to college, I would urge you to apply to Yale, where I've been teaching there now for 4 years. And I teach a course called The Next China. And it's really been astonishing to me as to the interest in the Yale community in a course like this. The first year I offered the course 4 years ago, without any sort of, even in academia they would call it marketing. No one knew about this course, no one knew about me. And 80 kids took the class, and some of the old seasoned Yale academics, they were a little bit out of shape by that, because 80 is sort of unheard of for a new course. And they said to me, look, there are a lot of people curious about you because you were one of these Wall Street characters, and you're borrowing from future enrollment. The enrollment will go down. Be willing to bet. The next year there were 130. The year after that there were 180. And last fall I just taught the course for 270 students in Yale. There's a huge appetite to learn about the Chinese economy. Not so much, the history of China. Yale's had some wonderful people, Jonathan Spence and others, who have talked about the history of modern China and even ancient China. but this is a forward-looking course that talks about the transformation from a producer model to a consumer model. And the story as I tell it, there are three legs to the stool, really. Building out the services sector to promote a new source of job creation for a China that's relied too heavily on manufacturing. Raising real wages with a powerful push to urbanization, with urban workers earning on average about 3 times their counterparts in the countryside. And then addressing the deep concerns over financial security by funding and building out a social safety net in areas such as retirement, pensions, Social Security, health care, unemployment insurance, and the like. And if the model works, it transforms China from a surplus saver to a nation that begins to absorb its surplus saving. And that changes many of the rules of engagement between China and the United States, because we need the surplus saver to keep providing us with the savings that we don't do at home and the treasuries that we cannot buy because of that. The debate was started on this transformation in earnest about 7 years ago with this statement by former Premier Wen Jiabao. It was formalized when the 12th five-year plan was put together and enacted in March of 2011. But that was, in retrospect, a framework rather than a blueprint for action. And now we have the 60 reforms that have come out of the third plenum of the 18th Party Congress that was held in November of last year, which I will admit postdates the book as it was written, but really reinforces so many of the key conclusions in the book. And China's on its way. And so China is rebalancing. And back to the codependency framework, we, the nation dependent on China, we got to take that for a given and figure out what that means for our economy, for our economic strategy. And sure, China, because of its large population, is going to overtake the U.S. A chart like this shows you, my estimates in the book, 2027. I've seen somewhere that occurs a good deal sooner. What about the next America, the other side of the coin here? The theme of the book Unbalanced is the action it applies. You can address the problems that emerge from the codependency of two unbalanced economies only by rebalancing. China's rebalancing, and it's not clear to me that we are in the United States. We're trying to resurrect our old growth model, the consumer-led growth model. I mean, look at, we just had a transition at the head of the Fed, and we celebrated the genius of Ben Bernanke. He's a great public servant and certainly did his very best to deal with a horrific crisis that occurred on his watch, a crisis, I would add parenthetically, that he also had a great deal of responsibility for creating, but this is not the time to be critical of a man who's performed such a great act of public service. But the policies he's adopted, quantitative easing, which seem likely to be the policies that will still shape the Fed for a good deal of time under Janet Yellen, are designed to stimulate consumer demand through wealth effects, giving big increases to equity markets and other financial asset values, including homes. And that's a consumer-led mindset that we just don't seem to be getting away from. I believe, as this chart illustrates, America suffered such a severe shortfall of national savings that the imperative for us is not to consume more, especially when we don't make as much as we used to, but to really rekindle something we've lost, and that is to save more. Not immediately, because saving, of course, will impede the growth of aggregate demand. You don't want that in a weak recovery, but we've got to talk about the incentives and the imperatives of saving and how we need to reinvest that savings in capital spending, on infrastructure, manufacturing capacity, and of course our people, investing in human capital. And in doing that, we've got to develop a competitiveness agenda in the United States that will enable us to turn more to exports rather than the excesses of internal private consumption to sustain economic growth. And China, with its transformation and with its history of being our third largest and most rapidly growing large export market, is a great opportunity for us. So the rebalancing implied by Unbalanced is really, if viewed strategically by the United States, is an enormous opportunity for us to discover a new recipe for economic growth. Both leaders dream a lot. You know, the China dream, of course, is a big campaign of Xi Jinping, and it's got deep historical roots, it's got social roots, it's got economic roots, and it's got some risks associated with it as well, given the tensions that have emerged in the East China Sea, but also the South China Sea. And critical to the China dream is to push the envelope on economic and financial reforms. And I note with great interest that the third plenum didn't just contain 60 reform proposals, but also contained a new implementation mechanism, this leading committee on the deepening of economic reforms, to really push ahead and implement some of the Chinese reforms that have really been tough to implement in recent years. And this is headed up, of course, by Xi Jinping as well. America, what does our rebalancing look like? Not much on the economic front. Certainly post wars in the Middle East and Afghanistan, we're talking about our own geostrategic rebalancing, the so-called pivot to Asia. And the two dreams can either work together or they can work in a dissonant way. And I think it's important for both nations to address their national aspirations from the standpoint of both economics, security, and social implications. I'm an optimist on China. I raise a number of questions about the United States. I'm inherently an optimist about the United States as well. Things have not gone that well for us in the last decade. This should be our wake-up call. I'm not sure that has sunk in to the power structure in Washington, and that's why I wrote the book. So I'll stop on that note and be delighted to take questions from you, Steve, or from anyone in the room.
Want to stay standing?
Sure.
First,
take the water.
First question, the Chinese are diversifying or increasing their exposure to hard assets, and some of that is flowing to the United States in the form of investment. What has become a trickle has now become a stream and may become a flood in the coming years. How does that affect the rebalancing?
Going global is a big deal for Chinese companies. I think we've certainly seen, as you say it correctly, a growing interest in expanding the reach. There are obviously some real political considerations in this country with how far the administration and the power structure is willing to let it go. It's a very sensitive issue. And so the Shuanghui-Smithfield transaction went through, but I know very well that was not the slam dunk you would think it would be, given the fact that this has to deal with food as opposed to anything of a high technology content. Lenovo, Motorola, who knows how that goes. And there's been a lot of sort of fractious issues in the past regarding whether it's Huawei or on the energy front with CNOC and Unical. There's still a lot of concern in the United States about the free flow of capital from nations like China and what they're going to do with American assets should they choose to venture into this area. I think that the Chinese will be judicious in moving. I don't see the stream turning into a raging torrent. I think they're very cautious in light of some of the misadventures that have occurred in the recent past, and they'll pick their spots pretty carefully.
But my question, I think, by the way, that we will remain open to investment. I think that the concerns in Washington will actually be overridden by local governments and state governments really wanting that investment. That there's a real divergence in view between kind of within the Beltway and everywhere else in the country. But my question was more, if this were to occur, in other words, they're talking about, I think the Chinese are talking about investing $1 trillion offshore in the coming few years, which would be less than a third of their accumulated reserves. Does that have an effect on the rebalancing?
Well, I think for them to say, if they were to shift their the mix of their foreign exchange reserves out of treasuries, put it this way, and just forget for a second the FDI implication that any shift that has implications for the currency. And so I think part of this rebalancing to a domestic economy would actually be very consistent with a further significant appreciation of their RMB. And for them to be willing to accept the consequences of a shift out of treasuries into other types of, whether it's hard assets or even other currency, should they choose to make a bet in that direction, they would have to make a judgment as to whether or not that fits with their consumer-led rebalancing. And a stronger currency, I think, is quite consistent with a consumer-led rebalancing because it gives domestic Chinese more purchasing power to buy overseas goods. So I don't find this at odds with the structural changes that I see occurring in the Chinese economy. But I'm still, I know they've thrown out the number like $1 trillion. I think that's a overly optimistic assessment of what they're likely to achieve in the next few years. I mean, they're going in that direction, but I don't think it will be that quick.
Over the last decade, or last 15 years, about 40% of our trade deficit has been a result of energy imports. When we look forward, by 2020, that's going to have virtually disappeared, which would start creating a better balance for the United States. China's on the opposite trajectory. Its energy, its requirements for imported energy are growing astronomically. How does that fit into kind of the rebalancing?
Look, it's a great question. I said this on TV recently, and I'll say it again. We're not going to frack our way into prosperity. We've got to do more than, just discover, a new technology to uncover shale oil. Fracking is a capital-intensive initiative. It's very powerful. It's important for us, but it barely makes a dent in the job problem that we have in the United States. China's got a serious energy problem, but the old model is a manufacturing model that relies hugely on a disproportionate share of global consumption of natural resources and energy. The transition from manufacturing to services, which is an essential ingredient of the new model, I think will be very helpful to China. And I would just point out that last year, Steve, the services sector, the tertiary sector, was actually larger for the first time in modern China's history than the secondary sector, which is manufacturing and construction. So, and services, of course, have a de minimis footprint in terms of energy consumption. So I think, and then China's of course aggressive in alternative sources of fuel, and they're growing rapidly, but it's off a very small base, and it's still a heavily coal-centric, carbon-intensive energy structure, and it's not clear to me that they're going to make any immediate progress in that regard, and that's very problematic, not so much for growth, but for environmental degradation issues.
Do you think you talk about this transition to a service economy in China, which they, in the past year, they went over 50%. And in the book, you talk about the opportunities that that creates for U.S. business. Can you talk specifically what those opportunities are, and also comment on whether you think the U.S. business community gets it, understands that opportunity?
Well, financial services, where I spent most of my life, and certainly gets it. I mean, they've been all over Chinese regulators to create beachheads in China. My former company, Morgan Stanley, of course, was the first to really crack the marketplace in building what is now really a world-class investment banking franchise in China, CICC, with a partner, the China Construction Bank. Non-financial services, though, I think ultimately are going to be vital and more important than financial services. I could never say that when I was working at Morgan Stanley, but now I'm sort of freed of my former code. I can actually make, I think, a very powerful argument that you look at some of the sectors in the distribution area, wholesale trade, retail trade, domestic transportation, supply chain logistics, they're minuscule compared to an economy the size of China. They've got to grow, and they've got to grow rapidly. And China has very little in the way of indigenous expertise in figuring out how to build transactions-intensive distribution industries like that. Healthcare, I mean, this is an enormous opportunity in China, especially given the high-speed aging courtesy of the one-child family planning policy in China. And even in financial services, just the processing function. And you know from your own experience, so much of the financial services in China, asset management in particular, is woefully underdeveloped. So there's a lot that can be done in services. We in the United States is clearly the world's quintessential services providing, producing economy. I think we have a great opportunity to be aggressive in pushing ahead and opening up these domestic services industries, not just in finance, but in the non-financial area. And there's a whole piece of the book that goes through and tries to make some estimates on the growth of the Chinese services sector between now and 2025, how much of that is tradable, how much of that is open to countries like the United States. And again, that's the opportunity. Shame on us if we don't seize it.
Let me ask one last question, and then I'm going to open it to the floor for questions. One of the great parts of this book is kind of the talks about myths and kind of pokes holes in the myths, and very direct in terms of you come out very clearly on the issues. And one of the parts that I liked was, he asked, does corruption have the ability to bring the economy down? And one would probably kind of give some hedging in the answer. First word of the answer, no, and then goes on. Now, I read that and I said, well, probably right. However, I can think about early in my career when I was working with some Southeast Asian countries, and their Ministry of Finance explained to me, you don't get corruption, you don't understand. It's just it's the grease for the wheels to move. So it's like a value-added tax. It's 3%, it's 4%. We keep moving ahead. Then what happened was it wasn't 3 or 4%, it moved to 30 or 40%. and you had such misallocation of resources as a result. So you built the bridge not because you needed the bridge. You built the bridge for the corruption that you could get out of the bridge. You built an auto factory not because you needed a new auto factory, because the children of the president could have the monopoly on that. And that caused the economy to collapse. So is there that threat? So when I think back to that almost 30 years ago now, and I think about China, is there that threat that you're going to get misallocation of resources driven by corruption, which actually causes enormous difficulty in the economy? And secondly, do you have issues where corruption has created situations like the housing is built not to standard and it collapses in an earthquake, or a high-speed rail system, because of money that's diverted to corruption, isn't functioning properly? So you have enormous economic and social costs.
Wow, those are really, better, I'm drinking water here, I need to go to the stronger stuff.
We have some wine in the back.
No, that's not going to be strong enough to deal with that.
We didn't say this would be easy, Steve.
Need some Chinese tequila. I think that corruption is, ultimately a major constraint for a nation, any nation, and certainly the corruption with Chinese characteristics, to borrow an overworked phrase, is an issue, and potentially a serious one. To his credit, Xi Jinping certainly has been quick off the blocks as a new leader to attempt to tackle this issue. And in speech after speech, he talks about the tigers and the flies. The tigers are the big guys. He's already taken down an unprecedented number of senior officials, former and current in the government, heads of SOEs, and I kept a running list for my last class. Got up to about 15, which is a significant number. It's probably now closer to 20. The real issue is the flies, though. The corrupt officials at the local level that really build these deeply entrenched power blocks between the party at the local level and SOE leadership at the local level as well, and certainly involves the allocation of credit of a very dispersed banking system as well. And that's just going to be a much tougher issue to address. The good news is that the one member of the Standing Committee who I really know the best, and any Wall Street guy will tell you he's good friends with Wang Xishan, is sort of cut out of the Jumanji, no-nonsense, tough, strategic thinker cloth. And as the chairman of the Discipline Commission, he is ultimately empowered with dealing with the flies. And I can't say I'm confident that he's got the program that will do it, but I know firsthand that there's a number of initiatives underway that he is considering pushing out that will make an effort in this regard. And the final thing I'd say about, well, I'll say two other things about corruption. The resource misallocation issue, I think, there's certainly examples of some of that in China, but in large part it's a myth. I go around the country all the time debating my good friend Jim Chanos. He talks about ghost cities and bridges to nowhere and investment shares of GDP at 50% and rising. And what Jim misses, other than the fact he's never been to China, is that the urbanization creates an enormous source of natural demand for expansion of infrastructure that has another 20 years to run. There are certainly some bridges to nowhere, but there are at least, according to McKinsey, 100 new cities with a minimum population of 1 million that need to be constructed between now and 2025, 2030. And so the investment required to do that is going to require a lot of bridges, a lot of airports, a lot of highways, a lot of buildings. Some of them will not be up to code. We saw that with the tragic earthquake, that resulted in so many awful deaths, especially of primary school children in Beichuan Village in 2008. I've seen the ruins of that firsthand. It's just haunting to see. But I think that is really being exaggerated as a symptom of a corrupt society. And the final thing I'll say on this is, again, the core premise of this book from the Chinese side is the producer model is going to become a consumer model. And a consumer society places different demands on its leadership and on the accountability of the leadership to deliver a system that's compatible with the aspirational values of individuals. And so by setting in motion this rebalancing, this is an enormous gambit for an authoritarian one-party state to take. And yet they're taking it. And I think ultimately this will be both a challenge and an enormous opportunity for a more enlightened model of leadership and political accountability in China that will be forced to address this corruption issue more effectively than has been the case under the old model for the last 30 years.
I asked way too many questions. Please let the audience start back here. Please identify. Do we speak loudly? We don't have
hear me.
mics.
Okay. So Bill Snow from CICC, the investment bank just mentioned. And yes, now we expand to New York, not just the business arm, also research arm. I'm an economist. So I'm going to bring this question to you.
You're an economist?
Yeah.
Oh, too bad.
Yeah, I feel that too. Yeah, but actually I think I haven't heard, like you probably have been asked a couple of times about this one, about the future Chinese growth path. And apparently now it's a very debatable question. One side of the story is because of the shrinking demographic dividend, so China will inevitably fall to a 5% or 4% of growth in the next 10 years. And also have some others saying that because China have the so-called backstart advantage and all the reform dividend, so China probably going to maintain 8% or 10% for the next 20 years. So my simple question is, what do you think about that?
Yeah, the growth debate is a huge issue in markets around the world. China did 30 years of 10% growth, and now it looks like it's moved into a 7 to 8% growth channel. And there's a lot of hand-wringing over the fact that you're seeing a 25% deceleration in the growth rate. I think this is a superficial analysis. What matters is not the quantity, but the quality of economic growth. I will take 7% growth from China any day if it's more balanced, if it's less resource, less energy intensive, if it's more labor intensive, as services are. You don't need 10% growth if you can absorb the same amount of surplus labor with 7, and the math suggests that you can. So I welcome the slowdown to 7.5% growth. I don't think it's a sign that China is moving down to a much weaker growth trajectory that threatens the demise of the Chinese development miracle. A lot of people ask me, they say, what about the middle income trap? You guys know what the middle income trap is? Developing economies usually, as you said, they pick the low-hanging fruits and reform. They grow a lot. They take their income from impoverished levels up to, $10,000 a year, and then they stall out. And most of them do. Very few of them have gone through it. You look at the ones that stall out, why do they do it? They stick with the old model. The model will take them from nowhere to 10,000. They think it will take them from 10 to 20, and it doesn't. You got to change the model. And so China, by changing the model, stands a much better chance of avoiding the middle income trap than others. So I think this idea that China's in the early stages of a major protracted slowdown of economic growth that will lead to an outbreak of social instability, it's a movie script. That's it.
Well, thanks.
Thank you.
Frank?
First of all, Professor Roach, I want to thank you for doing what you've done over the years, because you've been my defense in the face of so many critics, starting from Chuck Schumer on down to various economists about what's wrong with China. And I say, read Roach, read Roach. So you've been enormously helpful in my business. I've read your book. I have the advantage of having gone through half of it, unlike most of the folks in the audience, I think. And I want to bring up the other side of the equation, the American side, and its problems of unbalance. And I think I detect that there is a blind spot. You refer to the elephant in the room as something else. I won't even refer to it to not distract us. To me, the elephant in the room on the American side is the enormous amount of money that we as a nation put into national defense. We, depending on who you look at, equal in our defense budget the next 15 nations combined, or the whole world combined, number one. Every county in the United States has some national defense income source. All of those income sources tend not to be productive. They tend not to do anything, to go anywhere, to enhance the overall economy. So you mentioned that the United States is a hegemon. You use that word. And on the other hand, that it is the beneficiary of the savings of, was it Tennessee Williams or somebody else who said the benefit of
Kindness of strangers.
the kindness of strangers. That's right. The
And
kindness
it was
of strangers.
Tennessee one.
But I would guess that it's not so much the kindness of strangers, but the fact that the United States covers the world as the world's policeman, but just focusing on the economics. This is our big, big, big economic investment that doesn't help us, doesn't save, doesn't deal with the debt. What do you think?
That's a long, tough, important question. It's one that gets debated constantly by political scientists, economists, and by our leadership in Washington. My answer, though, is take a look at this chart. I'm sort of fixated on the lack of saving in the United States. When you don't save as a nation, things that you think you can afford ultimately are not affordable. We have voted with our feet as a body politic to build the greatest army, spend more than whatever the rest of the world on military, to police the world, to fight a number of wars. You can, in terms of saying it doesn't have any economic payback, that's debatable. It's hard to quantify. But the bottom line is, by committing to massive military power projection capabilities, and not saving to fund them, that puts us in a very precarious state in terms of being able to sustain our economic growth. And so the budget deficit, the shortfall of household saving, from my point of view, needs to be looked at, not just in the context of affording defense, but affording a number of other things that we've taken on as a nation. And I'm critical of, I wrote an op-ed piece after the third plenum where I talked, in the New York Times, where I talked about the differences between the U.S. and China. And I said, you know, Americans, we go about doing things differently than Chinese. China, you know, they have these Soviet-style 5-year plans, third plans where they all get together every 5 years and really talk about strategy. We don't really have a strategic debate and a framework to look at our issues. And so I ended the piece with something like, you know, maybe we need a third plenum moment in America. And if you could have seen the hate mail that came into my inbox after that, I mean, it was not pretty. So if I take your point, I don't really want to venture into the realm of arguing we should unwind our military capability. I just want to point out the consequences of having those commitments to the military, consequences of having a commitment to an inefficient healthcare system in a framework like this. It's a much more serious problem. It would be the case if we save more.
Go over here.
Professor, would you, regarding expenditure, it's regarding savings, I'm sorry, Ben Moore, architect, regarding savings, you know, you hear the typical, that a number of American families are underwater. Would you be willing to undertake in your class assigning some students to look at the typical American family budget, let's say, and decide what items might be snipped? I mean, I've walked around China. There clearly are families who are spending less than some American ones. But how does one go about deciding who should save, where they should put it? It's a dumb question maybe, but...
No, it's not a dumb question, but it is, it's definitely part of the debate over savings that needs to occur. I've been on this horse for a long time. And whenever I raise it, I get attacked. And I don't want to make this personal, but the guy who attacks me the most, she'll remain anonymous, but he has a beard and he writes a column in the New York Times on Mondays and Fridays. And he says, forget savings. We don't need to save. Because when a nation saves, the mirror image of saving is you put aside your spending to save. And so a weak recovery needs spending, not saving. And so that muzzles the debate. I think that's hugely incorrect and counterproductive. Again, my view on saving is that it need not occur today, but we need to have a debate over the incentives that need to be put in place to provide longer-term incentives for saving, especially if our largest source of surplus savings from abroad is going to start absorbing that surplus to fund its own economy. And what do I mean specifically? I give President Obama a lot of credit, the State of the Union address, of proposing new savings vehicles for low and middle income Americans. They don't have any. We can expand existing IRA and 401k plans. We can make, on your tax refunds, an automatic checkoff to deposit the refund into savings accounts. And by the way, the Federal Reserve, with running zero interest rate monetary policy for as far as the eye can see, is exacting a huge penalty on saving. Normalizing interest rates would go a big step in that direction. There's a number of things we need to discuss to be able to fund our future consumption, not our current consumption. And so the voice that shouts down saving because we need to consume today runs the risk of squandering our ability to support consumption in the future.
These are fascinating questions. We should probably try to focus on the China portion
And I'll be a lot briefer.
of the
I'll be a lot
Unbalanced because we are the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. Right there, yeah. And then the man next to you, yeah.
How can the U.S. compete with China when, let's say, Barack Obama had passed clean legislation, it said, for to increase he said that he would have a clean debt limit, which no one understands what that means, with no conditions attached. And it seems like the government can borrow unlimited.
Yeah, well, what I'm trying to do is focus it on
Yeah,
China
I'm gonna
now,
say
because
what
we have one of the great experts on China's economy. We can have a separate one on what the U.S. needs to do,
No,
but
I'm relating it.
okay, but then make it brief because we got 6 hands. Go ahead.
For example, and then, for example, if you want to go, if you shop at a store, everything is made in China. They make phenomenal things very at a discount. Go to like Forever 21, go to H&M, which are packed, made in China. So my question is, how can the U.S. compete with China?
It's not a question of us beating China. It's a question of us learning how to improve our economy and China improving its economy. I don't view this as many, and as your question implies, as a race between us or a competitive battle between us. It's something that we have to do, and I say this very clearly in the book. It's again back to the psycho theme. It's a treatise in self-improvement. We have to get better as a nation in running our economy, and the Chinese do too.
Nick?
What are the factors standing in the way of China achieving its rebalancing strategy?
There are a lot. The two that I would just highlight, one we've already talked about, inertia due to corruption and an unwillingness to dislodge entrenched power blocks. That's number one. Number two, and this was a puzzle to me for a long time, the unwillingness to fund the social safety net to address some of the issues that kept household savings far too high. I was hugely critical in many of my speeches inside of China on that, had direct discussions with senior Chinese leadership on this for a number of years. And the third plenum, by addressing the one-child policy, hukou reform, interest rate liberalization, and putting taxes on SOEs to fund the safety net, is a real affirmative answer to that. There are a number of other things that can go wrong, but those would be the two I would highlight.
Yes.
Yeah, you talk about
Louder.
You talk about helping the U.S. economy by increasing the savings rate. U.S. corporations are sitting on record amounts of cash, with trillions of dollars of cash. And how about helping the U.S. economy with more investments?
Again, I want to be sensitive to Steve's point, but I'll just be very brief. Companies have a lot of cash. They don't spend it on investment. They don't spend it on people if their demand expectations are weak. And that goes back to the American consumer. The American consumer is still on his or her back. Has been so in an unprecedented way for the last 6 years. And despite what all you hear from these optimists, the consumer is still in serious trouble, and companies are not going to put their money to work until that consumer demand story is fixed.
Get in the back there.
There is an impression that multinational corporations, including those from the US, are faring less well in China than they did, say, a decade or 2 decades before. And that's because they're not only facing stiffer competition, but also less friendly Beijing. For example, we're seeing Pfizer, GSK, Apple getting punished or sometimes harassed by various kinds of, because of bribery or other cases, that the local players are also doing the same. How do you make of Beijing's mindset behind this? And how would you think China's place as a destination for foreign investment would change because of this change in attitudes towards foreign investment?
Ask him to identify himself.
Who are you?
I'm Sui from the FT, the Financial Times.
Yeah, it's a great newspaper. It's a great question. I'd say a couple things. Number one, a lot of multinationals, US-based, are whiners. They're complaining. They're making a lot of money, and they're still raising issues that I think are not consistent with the commitment they made to China. Number two, I don't see any let-up in FDI into China. China's still, next to the US, the largest recipient of FDI of any country in the world. Number three, I'm hugely in favor of pushing ahead on a bilateral investment treaty, US and China, where I think there is now grounds for legitimate optimism after not being that way since the Strategic and Economic Dialogue of last July. This will address head-on some of the thorny issues of market access, which seem to be of growing concern to U.S., European, and other multinationals. I don't get, I don't subscribe to the notion that Beijing has just decided to make life uncomfortable for multinationals and FDI inflows into China when this has been a critical piece of the growth recipe that has worked so well for 30 years.
Last question on the far left.
Also,
Speak loudly and identify yourself.
okay, I'm Shao from Forbes. Also, or on the record, would you be able to offer some more details on the initiatives that Wang is considering pushing out? If not, then what additional measures do you think the leadership should be taking and would be possible for them to take tackling corruption given the current hurdles they're facing?
I'll give you his personal cell phone number. You can call him. No, I think one issue that's been discussed publicly, which I can allude to, would be broadening out the disclosure requirements for local officials. What do they own? What are the potential conflicts of interest between what they do in their day jobs and what their portfolios look like? I think disclosure is a very important first step toward making governance more transparent and addressing some of the corruption that results from that. Wang Qishan, I believe, is very much in favor of that, and we'll have to wait and see. It's something to watch.